Now, voting in the Russian presidential election doesn't close until Sunday, but the result appears a formality. One place where Vladimir Putin is expected to poll strongly, even by his own lofty standards, are the regions in occupied Ukraine. Moscow is working hard to get out the vote there, backed by an enthusiastic state media campaign.
A song and dance to get more people to vote in the occupied Ukrainian territories, or as Russian state-owned media call them, the new regions. The coverage is part of Russia's portrayal of its presidential election. Hosts and officials say on TV that the newly acquired citizens are grateful to Russia for letting them vote.
Our people arrived in liberated Avdiivka and talked to the locals, and they asked, "What are your needs? First and foremost, bread. There's a shortage of bread. Secondly, give us the opportunity to vote."
On screen, they assure viewers that casting a ballot has never been this easy. You don't even have to go to a polling station, as this journalist explains.
Members of the election commissions walk from building to building with the ballot boxes. They sing songs cheerfully and loudly. People hear this, come out and join the queues to cast their vote.
By the official start of the election on Friday, most residents of the occupied Kherson and Donetsk regions had reportedly voted early. There is no doubt that Vladimir Putin will claim a landslide victory here. Many Ukrainians were forced to leave their homes, but new residents came. Civil servants loyal to the Kremlin were lured to work here with huge salaries.
And I'm now joined by Michael Thumann. He is the Moscow correspondent for the influential German weekly Die Zeit. He's also the author of a new book called Revenge: How Putin Created the Most Threatening Regime in the World. Michael, welcome. First of all, we are speaking to you in Berlin. DW News is banned from Russia. Are you still able to report from there?
I am still able to report from Russia. Die Zeit, our office is accredited, and it is also being extended, sometimes on the very last day of the expiry date. But in general, we are able, but with all strings attached, so restricted areas where it's impossible to go. Of course, surveillance and of course difficulties to speak to officials who deny interviews if we ask for them.
Now let's talk about the presidential elections that are underway. We already know who's going to win. So what are the things you will be watching out for?
Well, I'd be watching out for the question whether Vladimir Putin, first of all, will be able to get more votes than he had last time, which was roughly 77%. And then, of course, how many people will vote, how many people will participate. So it was interesting to hear this morning that, for example, in my neighborhood in Moscow, as neighbors told me from there, that there were long queues of people who were working in ministries, and apparently they were organized and sent to the ballot box in order to ensure that participation in the election is high. And I think this is the biggest challenge now for the Russian administration, the Russian government, to ensure that enough people go to the polls, a poll which is decided beforehand.
So how much of a factor is the war in Ukraine for average Russian voters?
I think Ukraine is not a big factor. The so-called election campaign of Vladimir Putin has very much focused on living standards and what the government has been done to improve living standards. So Ukraine in itself was not a topic. What was a topic was the general big war against the West. The West, which is allegedly waging war against Russia. So this has been highlighted all the time. and Ukraine appeared more than as a footnote. And of course, this all contradicts reality, where Russia is fighting a big land war against Ukraine. But reality is not really what matters most in this election campaign.
Now, your book is called Revenge: How Putin Created the Most Threatening Regime in the World. Do you see revenge as the driving motivation? And if so, revenge for what?
Yes, I do see revenge as the driving motivation behind many moves of the Russian president and of the Russian government. And I think it is revenge for things that happened 30, 40 years ago, externally and internally. So first of all, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is in Russia today very often labeled as something which was brought upon the Soviet Union from outside, not from inside. It is also a revenge against primarily the US and its allies, of course, which took advantage, as they see it in Russia, as they portray it in Russia today, in the 1990s. And you have heard all these stories about NATO's eastward expansion. I think this is all being invented, but it is something which is the narrative today in Russia. And then, of course, it is revenge against those who dared to speak out in the 1990s and to take advantage of the freedom of speech and freedom of competition, political competition. And these people now, the regime now has, as I see it, successfully, unfortunately, silenced all these voices from the 1990s. So it's a revenge on all fronts.
All right, we want to go now to DW's Juri Rescheto. He's in Riga, where he has been based ever since Russian authorities shut down DW's Moscow bureau. Juri, it's good to see you. I got a lot to talk about with you tonight. First, I want to ask you, though, why is voter turnout so important to Vladimir Putin? I mean, we know that he can't lose this election, but if voter turnout were to look lower than expected or not excited, Putin could look like a loser, couldn't he?
Yeah, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the election itself, Brand. He knows that he will win. The result of the election in figures, in percentage is more important, not for Putin, but for the people around him, for his advisors, for the people in the presidential administration, because they want to show the Kremlin leader that they have done their job well and achieved a full 80% for him. According to media reports, this number is the goal. This is how many votes Putin should get and see at the end of the day. Because I hardly believe that Putin checks his popularity ratings every month based on opinion polls, but once every 6 years at the election, he finds out the result of his policies and possibly also believes that this result is real. The higher this figure is, the easier it will be for Putin to push through his policies. He has already announced tax increases, presumably to finance the war, and many also fear in Russia a new wave of mobilization.
So it sounds like, Juri, what you're describing is something like an election charade. It's not going to be fair, it's not going to be free, and at the end of the day, in Putin's Russia, it doesn't matter.
Well, there are plenty of indications that this election is indeed not without, let's say, irregularities. There is this one report from St. Petersburg that a young woman has thrown a Molotov cocktail. Green paint was tipped into some ballot boxes in other cities to make the ballot papers illegal. In Belgorod, on the border with Ukraine, one of the polling stations had to close as soon as opened due to an air raid. The electronic voting system apparently also collapsed for a while, but all this is nothing compared to the fact that proper election observation is no longer possible. Obviously, this year, for example, camera monitoring is no longer possible for election observers.
And on this first day of voting, there are reports that people have thrown a Molotov cocktail at a polling station in St. Petersburg. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, we've heard many reports about other irregularities. The attacks from Ukraine, for example, on Belgorod, and more recently, apparently also on Kursk, another region, are mostly certainly a sign, a warning, a destabilizing measure, especially when you consider that these attacks in the recent days and also today, at least in the recent, have been carried out by the Russians themselves, by Russian citizens fighting on the side of Ukraine. These are volunteer units, combat units that have different names: Freedom from Russia, Siberian Battalion, and so on. And they all say clearly they are fighting against Putin. Their goal, they say, is not that much liberation of Ukraine, but the fall of the Putin regime, as they call it. By the way, Putin has already commented on those attacks today earlier. He said at the meeting of the Russian Security Council in Moscow, he was sure the Russians would respond to the attacks with even greater unity. We will see in the next days how it will end.
I want to ask you more of a personal question. Our viewers will know that you have covered many elections in Russia. This is the first time that you can't actually be in the country to cover this. You can't, pursue the truth because of Vladimir Putin. What goes through your mind as this election gets underway?
This election is for the first time for 3 days, and the Russian authorities try to do everything to rise the turnout, to make as many people as possible to come to this election. As you mentioned, the turnout is very important for Putin. His goal is 80%, and I wouldn't say 80% is possible, but he still enjoys high popularity in Russia, according to the last surveys. And there is no other candidate allowed to participate, no other opposition candidate allowed to participate in this election. So it would be a win for Vladimir Putin for the next 6 years more in Russia.
DW's Juri Rescheto reporting tonight from Riga. As always, Juri, thank you.